It's my pleasure today to introduce Charles D. Tarlton, author of Reflections on Edmund Burke. Charles is a retired political science professor who taught at universities in Victoria, BC, Canada, California, and New York, and is Professor Emeritus, University at Albany, the State University of New York. Poetry has always been central in his life, even as he pursued a career and a living teaching political ideas. In recent years, he has focused almost entirely on writing poems, and this offering, Reflections on Edmund Burke, is his most recent work. He lives on the shore, now in Connecticut, with his wife, Anne Knickerbocker, an abstract painter, and Nikki, their black standard poodle. And now Candace James from Silver Bow Publishing will say a few words.
Yes, it's not often you hear just a few words from me, but today I'll keep it at a few. It's just a terrific book, I must say. It's one that's very interesting in every way, and I think anybody that reads it will be very, very pleased when they're finished it. And anybody that wants it can actually, it's on sale worldwide through Ingram Spark iPage, so you can get it in Europe, Australia, you can get it anywhere because it's that good of a book. And I hope people buy it because Charles has really taken an excellent amount of time to make it truly interesting from the first page to the last. And having said that, I shall now turn it over to the great Charles Tarlton.
Oh, that's almost too much introduction. Well, hello, everyone. I'm going to read 6 poems from this book about Edmund Burke, but I want to say a few things in advance of that. I first encountered Edmund Burke in a graduate seminar at UCLA many years ago and wrote a paper on his reflections on the revolution in France. He was an arch conservative writer, very hostile toward the French Revolution. And he sort of slipped into the background after that for me. When I finished my teaching career, my wife and I retired to France, and we moved into a little house in the north of France. And I had a first thought that I would keep writing political theory articles like a number of my colleagues had done when they retired. But I lasted about 2 weeks doing that. All across my life, I have written poetry piecemeal, bits and pieces here for birthdays, anniversaries, different kinds of things. Like I had submitted and published poems in student publications on campus at Albany and in Christchurch, New Zealand. I always kept my hand in, and I read a lot of poetry, but I never thought of it as a full-time occupation. But I was there in France, and having abandoned the political theory, was flopping around looking for something to do. Retirement, I found, gives you a lot of time. So I read somewhere at the time an article on a Japanese poetic form that I can't remember what it's actually called in Japan, but in the United States, it flourishes under the name of Tonka prose. And the Tonka prose form is a prose paragraph, in its simplest version, is a prose paragraph followed by a 5-line Tonka poem, which is a poem written, strictly speaking, when it's done strictly, is in the Japanese syllable system or whatever. It's not really a syllable system, but it would be a number of stresses per line. In 5 lines, there would be 7, 5, 7, 7, no, 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. In the form it's popular in the United States, it's short, long, long, so that the lines have a kind of balance in that way, but you don't count syllables so strictly. So that's the device I used in writing the poetry for this book. It's an instance of that. So I'm sitting in France trying to figure out what to do, and I run across this poetry in a variety of places, and I got in touch with the editor of a journal that was for a long time very active called Haibun Today. The editor of that journal and I got into elaborate correspondence. I had sent some stuff to him, and I really didn't submit it to him to get him to publish it. I submitted it to him saying, can you help me with this? I like this form, but I'm not sure what I'm doing. So he, for the next year or so, he more or less gave me a course in the writing of this poetic form. And then I began to publish things in that journal and in a couple of other journals. And I did that for a very long time. And that was the only place I published. But gradually, that one went out of business and a couple of others. And I was always interested in other things too. But so I kind of shifted my ground into other forms of poetry. In this book, though, I went back to that form. And I picked another book by Burke, which I had never read or had not paid enough attention to. I don't think I ever finished the book as a student and so on. And it's called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of the Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, which was this peculiar book that Edmund Burke wrote in the midst of all his political stuff about art and beauty and love and beauty. And it's an astonishing little book. And so I was reading that. So then I decided I would sort of interpret or use poetry as an interpretive device to look at some of what was going on in that book. So without further ado, I'm going to read 6 of these poems. The first one is on page 17. It's called Pretty, Pretty Love. And we explain the form in this sense. The first part of what I'm going to read is a quote from Burke, taken from the Sublime and the Beautiful. And then that's followed by a structure of Tonka prose in which there is a prose passage in response to Burke, followed by, in most cases, the form I used most of the time when I wrote Tonka prose was prose followed by 3 Tonka, which I thought gave you more room to expand on the thing. So anyway, it's a quote by Burke, and I'll tell you when that's finished, and then the prose by me, and then the 3 poems. So here is Pretty, Pretty Love. This is Burke. By beauty, I mean that quality or those qualities in bodies by which they cause love or some passion similar to it. I confine this definition to the merely sensible qualities of things for the sake of preserving the utmost simplicity in a subject, which must always distract us whenever we take in those various causes of sympathy which attach to any persons or things from secondary considerations and not from the direct force which they have merely on being viewed. And then my stuff. The poets talk in dewy words of love, pine for lost or unrequiting loves, dwell endlessly on pert little noses or rosy cheeks, curls tumbling wild in breezy disarray, but seldom speak of glands or sweat. Love words idealize beloveds, using fantasy's eraser to eliminate evidence of the artist's first rough sketch. They stand us back the perfect distance so that moles and little dark hairs fade from view. Love steps forward, glad for the chance to tie onto beauty, allows the ugly to pretend and squint into the mirror and see only what wants to be seen. The loved one's a mannequin, then a doll, sanded smooth and lacquered without pores, perfectly proportioned. A poem makes you stop your head and sharply turn on the oddity of phrase, the sudden music in someone's speech. List your loves, then try imagining faces measured against each other based on looks. Who did you love the more? And the second poem is on page 21. And this is called Cosmic Assonance. First, the Burke. Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. Your eyes close involuntarily. Your heart races and streams of perspiration seep out onto your skin and soak your clothing. An overwhelming ache to be somewhere, anywhere else, rises up and obliterates all other thoughts. Your muscles contract, your body and your mind harden, paralyzed and suppressing a panic scream from somewhere down inside the stone your body has become. The line between here and now on the one side and suffering, destruction, and death on the other, the line marked by dread, threatens to evaporate and let the terror come across. But here, a weird pleasure, one might say, a sublime pleasure prevails. As long as the situation remains static and nothing happens, oh God, you pray, don't let this happen. The poems. The whole cosmos has enlisted in your stars and you become preeminent, the massive pileup on the darkened freeway. The center holds where you are near the center for the moment, the all-encompassing moment, the real truth. But as nothing lasts forever, as trees all undergo transformations, so the moment comes and goes, and the focus moves away. And the next one is on page 29. And this is called A Grain of Sand. First, the Burke. As the great extreme of dimension is sublime, so the last extreme of littleness is in some measure sublime likewise. When we attend to the infinite divisibility of matter, when we pursue animal life into these excessively small and yet organized beings that escape the nicest inquisition of the sense, when we push our discoveries yet downward and consider those creatures so many degrees yet smaller, and the still diminishing scale of existence, in tracing which the imagination is lost as well as the sense, we become amazed and confounded at the wonders of minuteness, nor can we distinguish in its effect this extreme littleness from the vast itself. It is the geological history of the world. First, solid walls of hardened stone were left by volcanoes under the sea, and then the seismic force of sliding continents broke those walls into slabs that slid and bounded over one another just before pieces were broken off in the crush of large and small earthquakes, pieces the size of footballs, then grapefruit, and finally eggs. Second, the rolling oceans, sliding ice, and the grinding winds make farther breaks to stones, from stones to pebbles, to pea gravel, rough sand, sand and fine sand that sifts sometimes even on the wind. Now this one has a little bit of a complication in the talk of prose. Each talk of prose is preceded by a separate abstract statement. In infinite divisibility of matter. Lilliputian fantasy, little people come in my dreams to carry the world away in pieces. Nicest inquisition of the sense. Divisive questions asked in failing tones, softer and softer, mute murmurings go unheard from tiny tumbling grains. Self-diminishing scales of existence. Molecules serve the model of the universe. Each solar system's its own bijou electrons circling around. Okay. The next one, the longest one, is on page 37. That is the longest one. Yeah, okay. This is called, and excuse my mispronunciation of the Latin, Contradictio in Terminis. First part, number 1. Burke. Mr. Locke has somewhere observed with his usual sagacity that most general words, most those belonging to virtue and vice, good and evil especially, are taught before the particular modes of action to which they belong are presented to the mind, and with them the love of the one and the abhorrence of the other. The movies we saw as children played on the ideal of heroism, the perfections of democracy, the wisdom of fathers, the fairness of the police, and the singular nature of America. We were ill prepared then for the revelation of American cruelty and warfare, the racism in social relations, the greed that defined class relations, and the elitism that later oozed from every institution. Still, we deceive ourselves, euphemistically calling our murders stale and impricely in liquidation. Someone's been rubbed out. We love our virtue, despise corruption, but still take more deductions than allowed. Self-preservation stands high in God's regimen. Number 2, the Burke. When afterwards the several occurrences in life come to be applied to these words, and that which is pleasant often appears under the name of evil, and what is disagreeable to nature is called good and virtuous. A strange confusion of ideas and affection arises in the minds of many, and an appearance of no small contradiction between their notions and their actions. They name your favorites shameful, try to make you proud of the depraved stuff that throws us rudely off our game. We run dizzily, turning everything around us, deranging us, muddling every consequential act, turning the ethical upside down. Number 3, the Burke. There are many who love virtue and who detest vice, and this not from hypocrisy or affectation, who notwithstanding very frequently act ill and wickedly in particulars without the least remorse. Because these particular occasions never came into view when the passions on the side of virtue were so warmly affected by certain words heated originally by the breath of others. Here's a cosmic joke of huge proportions. The moral center of the universe, the hot, molten core of good and evil, was thrown together in the monstrous act of creation and bled like dark paint stirred into white half-heartedly, a marbling effect, risking hypocrisy's self-contradiction. So whatever the outcome, the doer is always on morality's side when the hideous deed is done for the purest of reasons. What's the sense of do not kill in a world of holy molten rock, hissing as it devours itself, making more devouring rock? He has a mind unseeing all distinction, holds malleably to whatever meaning suits just the way that he remembers. Number 4, the Burke. And for this reason, it is hard to repeat certain sets of words, though owned by ourselves unoperative, without being in some degree affected, especially if a warm and affecting tone of voice accompanies them, as suppose wise, valiant, generous, good, and great. It was in May 1966, with the academic year over and the money from a nice National Endowment Fellowship safely in the bank, we flew into Madrid on Iberia to begin our European summer. I knew no Spanish, so my little bit of Southern California Mexican would have to see me through. One day I was standing at the back of a large crowd in the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, where a well-known Falangist speaker was haranguing the crowd. He spoke with great emotion, using outsized gestures, but he was speaking Spanish. As he was speaking Spanish, I understood virtually nothing. Still, I felt my emotions rise as he repeated, emotionally pounding the lectern with his fists, the words, La patria, valores, el Estado, violencia, dialéctica de las pistolas. We always assume the dog's excited barking means something, that her repeated sounds are language, though we cannot understand. And the thunderstorms darkening and rumbling all afternoon are surely filled with meaning, their hearkening tone of voice. Okay, so that's all of the poems from the Sublime and the Beautiful. In one edition of this publication, Burke had appended what he calls a coda dealing with the question of taste. So I'm going to read a couple from that section, which I always found very interesting. The first is called Whim, Fancy, and Caprice. The Burke. I make no doubt but that the logic of taste, if I may be allowed the expression, might very possibly be as well digested, and we might come to discuss matters of this nature with as much certainty as those which seem more immediately within the province of mere reason. And indeed, it is very necessary at the entrance into such an inquiry as our present to make this point as clear as possible. For if taste has no fixed principles, if the imagination is not affected according to some invariable and certain laws, our labor is likely to be employed to very little purpose, as it must be judged a useless, if not an absurd undertaking, to lay down rules for caprice and to set up for a legislature of whims and fancies. Absolute truth lies only in the surety of logic, or under the fires of religious conviction, both places where all answers are known in advance, and doubtless in the circularity of their tautology, wherein the same thing is uttered twice in different words. Here we come to the moral equivalence of the old saw, everything in the world is red, of course, except the things that aren't. The only resolution to the great aesthetic and ethical disparities in the world is to insist then that some of the world are wrong. The man stands leaning on his umbrella before Excavation by Wilhelm de Kooning, claiming in a loud voice to know it is the representation of an old Dutch resort just outside in Muidenstrand. Others in the gallery shake their heads, muttering inaudibly. Even the atom strays from its appointed path, knocked off the rails by curious looks in that direction. The role of the rule is to delimit choices, to legislate what anyone can call beautiful or good. I know nothing, the German officer said, about art, but I know what I like. Quaint villages in a medieval vein. And finally, from this section, a poem called Transduction. The Burke. If we suffer ourselves to imagine that their senses present to different men different images of things, this skeptical proceeding will make every sort of reasoning on every subject vain and frivolous. But as there will be little doubt that bodies present similar images to the whole species, it must necessarily be allowed that the pleasures and the pains which every object excites in one man, it must raise in all mankind, whilst it operates naturally, simply, and by its proper powers only. Here is crystalline sophistry writ coolly in its givens. The first assumption, everyone's senses present the same impressions of the world. There just is no doubt that things feel, smell, taste, and sound the same to everyone. The second proposition, it follows of necessity that the pleasure and pain generated in one person by anything in the world has to be likewise generated in everyone else. Third, of course, that doesn't hold if there's been any unnatural shenanigans. For instance, if someone spread mustard on your frosted layer cake. The syllogism's force makes of necessity facts generate pleasure equally to all as an act of discipline. Not all noses are the same. My standard poodle smells long distances and trouble and fear and illness, one skin flake in a trillion. On a little breeze, the jockey smells horse sweat, sailors just the sea, the scent of death in the wood, incense in the transept. Okay. That's it.